Okay, so now that I have a little bit more time, I'm going to put a bit more effort into getting these kind of videos out again. And I'm starting with one that probably isn't as popular, but I suppose there's some interesting things to note in it. And it's something that does come up quite a lot. So I think I got these notes from a course I was doing this time last year with the triage method. It's just a coach's corner where they give you this information sort of in the same kind of framework as this. Obviously, they give it with a lot more detail, and I have a copybook full of stuff that I'd probably like to eventually get up on this YouTube. But I suppose do it with my own twist and do it in a more simplified version, as theirs is quite detailed, and it takes me a while to even get my head around it. So this is just a practical review of a very common theme among the general public, which is rotator cuff injuries or shoulder issues that people jump to, I suppose, the conclusion that it's their rotator cuff straight away. It seems to be a very common theme where if someone has any sort of pain in their injury, they go like this and they just think, oh yeah, my rotator cuff. I don't know why it started. Maybe a few people were diagnosed all at once, or maybe there's a local physio diagnosing everyone with the same problem. Who knows? But anyway, it seems to be not just local. So the overview is first just to talk a bit about joints. So human joints involve a combination of these movements: transition, slide, glide, roll, and spin or rotation. So most joints have synovial fluid, which allows you to nourish cartilage, acting as an important lubrication, reducing friction. So this is the feeling when you start exercising and you feel a little bit tight, or maybe your first few sets don't feel as good, but the more you get into the session, you start to feel a bit more freedom in your movement. There's a bit more comfort there in the movement, and oftentimes that's your synovial fluid just moving around and acting as a lubricant. When we're talking about the rotator cuff, it's shoulder, and we're going to the glenohumeral joint, so GHJ, even though I'm going to probably refer to it as the glenohumeral joint anyway. So it's an attachment of the upper extremity to the trunk. It's a ball and socket joint which allows for flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, internal and external, and horizontal abduction and adduction movements. So this is a very complicated joint. It's a very busy one. It's a ball and socket joint, and it's got 3 degrees of freedom, which is quite a lot. So there is a lot going on in this joint. It's very hard to isolate it down to one thing. So rotator cuff information. The glenohumeral joint rolls and glides. If it were only to roll, it's probably dislocated, so it should roll and glide. Rotator cuff tears are usually acute or degenerative. So acute would mean it's a tear where you can identify the event. You put your arm out and someone runs into it and you feel it go. That's an acute tear. There's an event. You can associate the injury to that event. Degenerative is just tear without an identifiable event. So something that happens over time. You often would have heard of wear and tear. It's very normal. So rotator cuff muscles are always being trained pretty much any time you train the upper body. So in reality, everything works together. And this leads on to the whole thing of people warming up their rotator cuff before they go into their exercise. I mean, your rotator cuff will warm up with pretty much every upper body exercise. I don't think there's a need to isolate it. And for most people, they probably can't even isolate that because everything is working together and it's such a complicated joint. So rotator cuff muscles are always being trained pretty much any time you train upper body, which we went over. A lot of muscles wrap around the head of the humerus, even the long head of the bicep. So there's a lot of muscles wrapping around that head, and for you to be able to isolate one of those would be pretty impressive. So the vast majority of people, it seems, do not need to isolate, and also cannot isolate their rotator cuff unless it's for a very specific rehab. Again, I'm talking about that acute tear where you might have to hold certain positions to rehab it for your sport or for your surgery. It really isn't simple. Within that space, you've got ligaments, muscles, fibers, tissues, and it's a very complicated part of the body. So rotator cuff abnormalities is normal. It's quite normal. And especially as you age, much like the disc problems I've spoke of before. So we spoke of disc protrusion, disc degeneration, and other disc issues, and how as you age, it's much like getting grey hair. It's just a part of life that these things begin to move or degenerate or change. And it doesn't mean, these abnormalities doesn't always mean it's the causality of an injury or causality of any pain. So 50% of people in their 50s are asymptomatic. And as a result, if they have an event or get knocked over, the MRI findings may assume it's a new tear. So 50% of people in their 50s are walking around with these tears already. They might have a knock or an injury. It mightn't tear anymore. But because that tear is there and they've gone and got the MRI or gone and got the scan and now it's been diagnosed as an acute event, that might not be the case. It might be the case, but it might not be the case, seeing as so much of the population are already going around with these degenerations. Especially once you pass the 50s, 60s, it's going to go even more and more. So surgery doesn't seem to have a huge benefit ahead of other approaches when it comes to this kind of degeneration. And this can bother some people a lot. So it gives some people a lot of trouble. This, let's say the 50% of people who are asymptomatic, they're fine. Other people going around might have serious symptoms where they're in a lot of pain, and other people, it mightn't bother them in the slightest. So it is a case-by-case kind of injury, or case-by-case profile. So to make it very basic, seeing as it is quite a common thing, what do? You work around it and you keep it KISS. So KISS, keep it stupid simple. Or keep it simple, stupid, one or the other. Seeing as research shows how prevalent it is in people with no symptoms, keep training, as getting a routine and including some sort of resistance regime is usually a good idea, 9 times out of 10. Focus on what you can do, even if there are movement limitations, rather than putting the emphasis on what you cannot do. So if pressing overhead is causing a lot of issues, think about getting a landmine and pressing more in this direction, or pressing in ways that is pain-free to you and that's easy for you, and getting strong through that range rather than just focusing on the range you cannot even complete at body weight and trying to load that, putting yourself under more pressure. So everyone has limitations at different stages. Training around that is a part of life. So the main message is rotator cuff. Sometimes it's not as simple as that. It's not always a rotator cuff if your shoulder is injured, so don't just jump to the conclusion. Understand that there's a lot going on with the body, so especially in the shoulder joint, pretty much any time you're pressing or pulling, your rotator cuff is going to be used there. It's extremely hard to isolate, so let's not look for reasons to not move. Let's work within our limitations and just keep training toward that, and you'll be surprised how much benefit you can get from that in terms of progress and in terms of creating a pain-free or a more pain-free environment.